Morning, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Mondays with Mendy. Today we're going to explore a sanctuary in time. As we know, time waits for no one. It is one of the constants in our lives. It is constantly ebbing and flowing, and without question, it's something that we never have enough of. We're always trying to get a little bit more time and get more out of our time. So what does it mean to have a sanctuary in time? How do you find an oasis, a place where you can go to take stock of what you've achieved and what you have yet to achieve, and collect your thoughts as you try to maximize your time here on earth? There's a story told about a successful CEO who was sitting on the beach one day, and sitting on the beach in this small Brazilian fishing town, when he notices a local fisherman is taking his boat out and going fishing. He sees the fisherman go out and catches some fish. A short while later, the fisherman comes back in and he's done. Puts up his boat, takes his fish, and goes home. And he sees that this goes on for a couple of days, so eventually the CEO is intrigued enough to go over to the young fisherman, the local fisherman, and ask him, "Tell me, sir, what are you doing?" He says, I got a small little business. I go out, I fish for a couple hours in the morning. Then I'm done for the day. He says, "Really? That's it?" He says, "Yeah, I go home, play with my kids, then I take a little nap in the afternoon. And after that, I go out for dinner with my friends and my family, and we sing, we drink, we dance the night away. And then I go to sleep, and we do the same thing the next day." He says, "Yeah, listen, I'm a successful CEO. I've got a PhD from Wharton Business School. I've run Fortune 500 companies. Let me tell you what I suggest you need to do to grow your business." He says, "All right, I'm all ears." So he tells the local fisherman, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to stay longer at sea today. Forget about playing with the kids and all of that stuff and the nap. I want you to work longer." He says, "Okay, what am I going to do then?" He says, "Well, if you go out and you stay longer on your boat, you're going to catch a lot more fish." "All right." He says, "You're going to catch a lot more fish. Then you're going to go out and buy a bigger boat so that you can go out and catch even more fish. And once you do that, you're going to have enough money that you can buy a few boats. You're going to buy a few boats, and your business will continue to grow. Eventually, you're going to have to move to Sao Paulo." He says, "Okay, what am I going to do then?" He says, "You're going to move to Sao Paulo, be able to run your corporate headquarters, and have fishing groups, fishing personnel in these different villages and locations." He says, "Okay, what then?" He says, "Then you're going to get so big, you're going to become so wealthy that it'll be time for you to list your company on the stock exchange." He says, "Wow, that's amazing." He says, "Then you're just going to be super rich." He says, "And what's going to happen then?" The fisherman asks the CEO. He says, Then when you are super, super wealthy, then you'll be able to go out for a couple hours in the morning, just fish for pleasure. Then you can play with your kids, take a nap in the afternoon, and dance and drink the night away." He says, the fisherman turns to CEO and says, "But isn't that what I'm doing right now?" This story is an old parable that's told to highlight how when we run through life, oftentimes we don't recognize that we're running in a circle, trying to get to the next step and the next stage and the next process, only to arrive back at the beginning of the entire journey. So why are we rushing through and running and running and running when in reality we're only going to arrive at the place where we started? Time is tricky. It is. And oftentimes we find ourselves looking for that moment of peace and tranquility, only to see it escape us yet again. So as we do every week, we take an example from the weekly Torah portion to try and illuminate a topic, an issue that we deal with on a regular basis. And so in understanding how time works and how you find a sanctuary in time, you find the ability to take a break and take a rest and not get consumed by the rat race. We're going to look in this week's Torah portion, which delves into the laws of the temple. If you remember, just a couple weeks ago, we went through all of the laws of the construction of the temple in the parsha called Teruma. The Torah portion of this week, which is known as Vayakel, is really a repetitive portion, seemingly, and it seems to simply repeat and review all of the details in constructing the Mishkan. The only difference and distinction being that previously it talked about how to build the temple and tabernacle, and now the portion says here's how they actually built the temple and tabernacle. But of course, every portion, every word, every letter in the Torah is specific, and therefore has something powerful to teach us all. So what do we learn from this portion? So one amazing thing that it speaks in this portion is about the temple and Shabbat, and why the two are connected and juxtaposed, one right after the other, because that's the way we see in the portion. It talks about Moses telling the Jewish people to start building the temple, etc., 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 and then going on to say, in 6 days you should work, but on the seventh day you should rest. So we see quite clearly that the building of the temple, the construction of the temple, the traveling temple, and the performance and celebration of Shabbat are intrinsically connected. And the obvious question is how? What is the connection between the two? So first of all, Rashi, foremost commentary, tells us, he says that when Moses presented the instruction to keep Shabbat, before the commandment, just before the commandment to construct the Mishkan, he's telling us that even though building the temple, the tabernacle, is an important work, it still does not supersede the celebration of Shabbat. So when Shabbat comes and it's time to rest, you got to rest. You can't get consumed by the fact that you want to continue building the temple. It's time to rest. You have to rest. Nothing is more important than rest. So we see instantly a connection between the two. But the correlation continues. It's deeper than that. It's not just the fact that they weren't allowed to build the temple on Shabbat. There's actually something essential between the two, essentially connected between these two things. Shabbat is a celebration. It is a time of rest. And we have two ways of doing that. We add in certain actions. We eat more, we pray more, spend more time with our families, we study more. But we also have the fact that on Shabbat we refrain from certain activities, certain labors. What are those activities and labors? And this is a question I get asked all the time. How do you define what is considered work and what is not considered work? Because we know it's not based on strenuous activity. Flicking on a light, turning on a light is the simplest thing, requires no strenuous activity, and yet traditionally it's refrained from doing on Shabbat. So how are these works defined? And the answer is that they are learnt from the temple, from the construction of the temple. The Talmud says that the principal labors of the temple were 39. There were 39 primary activities done in the temple. And those 39 activities are the 39 primary activities that we refrain from doing on Shabbat. Again, another intrinsic, essential connection between Shabbat and the Mishkan, the temple, tabernacle, that the works, the 39 primary activities done in the temple, tabernacle, are the 39 activities that we do not perform on Shabbat. Why would the Torah, why would God choose such a cryptic manner for teaching us about how we celebrate Shabbat? Shabbat is so important, one of the most essential traditions in Jewish life, and yet you choose a very mysterious method to teach the Jewish people which activities they should refrain from on Shabbat. We learn it from the Mishkan, the activities of the Mishkan, and the fact that they were the Mishkan was, you were not allowed to build the Mishkan on Shabbat, tells us that the activities that they used to build the Mishkan, that's what you don't do on Shabbat. Why don't you just come out and say it? Say, here's what you don't do. 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, 30, 39. Done. So obviously there's a very deep connection between the two. And what is that? And the answer is quite simple. Both the Mishkan, the temple, the tabernacle, and Shabbat are both sanctuaries. One is a sanctuary in time, and one is a sanctuary in place. Starting off with the Mishkan. The Mishkan, the temple tabernacle, was a physical location designed with wood, with textiles, with precious metals, as a physical place that people could come to and feel a greater sense of connection to God, to their spirituality, than anywhere else on earth. It was a sanctuary, it was an oasis in the physical world in place where they could get a greater sense of connection. Shabbat also is a sanctuary. Shabbat is a respite in time, so not in place. Of course, you can celebrate Shabbat anywhere in the world, but you can't celebrate it any time. Friday sundown till Saturday night when the stars come out, you are removed from the hustle and bustle of the work week, the ebbs and flows, the ups and downs of your everyday job. You're removed from all of that, from the digital distractions that exist in society today, to a peace of quiet, a time of tranquility. That is your sanctuary you can run to every week, your sanctuary in time. So we see right off the bat, both the Mishkan, the temple, the tabernacle, and Shabbat are both sanctuaries. Only they're in two different realms. One is in the realm of place, and one is in the realm of time. But still very, very similar, very, very compatible one with the other. However, the connection between the two is even deeper. It's not just about the fact that both are sanctuaries. It's even greater in so that the Mishkan and Shabbat are both celebrated, both hallowed in two parts. There are two parts to the Mishkan becoming a sanctuary in time, two dimensions, two phases, and as well two dimensions, two phases in Shabbat becoming a sanctuary in time, two aspects. We'll start off with the Mishkan. For the Mishkan, the temple, the tabernacle, to become a special place, a sanctuary in the physical world, two things had to happen. Number one, there were prohibited activities, certain things that could not be done in the Mishkan or Mikdash. A human being that did not belong in the temple could not enter into the temple. There was a certain space where Jewish people were allowed to go to bring sacrifices, but into the holiest part of the tabernacle, nobody was allowed to go unless you were a Kohen or a Levi, a priest or a Levite. Therefore, you were there to perform the services required. Besides that, you could not go there. It was prohibited. And the fact that it was prohibited made this a special place. It made it a special place because it's now been designated and set aside for specific activities. Even the Kohen and Levi, even the priest, could not enter certain parts of the temple if he was not needed to be in that location. If he was not required to be there, he could not be there. That was the first thing. So we have a prohibition that creates a greater designation. Then you have dimension number two, the second aspect, that there were special activities done inside of the temple tabernacle which gave it greater holiness and significance. The Holy of Holies, which is where the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, entered only on Yom Kippur, that gave it a greater special quality than anywhere else in the world. And that's why indeed it's called the Holy of Holies. So, the Mishkan, the temple, the tabernacle, it was a sanctuary in time, but in two phases. Number one, we had prohibited phase, which meant that it received its holiness from what was not allowed to be done there. And we have dimension number two, where it receives its holiness by what is being done there. The same parallel is seen in the holiness, in the sanctuary in time of Shabbat. Shabbat is special. Shabbat is unique in two aspects. And the way the Torah tells us this is really cool. Of course, you know that celebrating Shabbat is one of the 10 Commandments. It's the fourth of the 10 Commandments. And in the Torah, in the Bible, it says the 10 Commandments twice. Once in the second book, in the book of Exodus, and once in the fifth book, the book of Deuteronomy. It says twice the 10 Commandments. But there are some minor distinctions between the way they are recorded in each of these places, although, of course, they're still the 10 Commandments. So when it comes to Shabbat, we see a very strong distinction. In the first recitation, in the book of Exodus, it says, remember the Shabbat day to make it holy. Perfect. In the second instance, in Deuteronomy, it says, keep the Shabbat day to make it holy. So what does it mean? Remember and keep. In Hebrew, that's known as Zachor and Shamor. What is the distinction between these two terms? And what do they teach us? Because they're actually two completely different and distinct terms. To remember something is to do something positive associated with the holiness of that day. And what is it referring to, of course? It's referring to Kiddush. It's referring to these special traditions that we do uniquely on Shabbat, which remind us of how special this day is. Then we have the second dimension that's recorded in Deuteronomy: keep the Shabbat, protect the Shabbat. And of course, that's referring to the things we do not do on that day. We protect it, we keep it special by not doing X, Y, and Z. And so Shabbat, just like the Mishkan, just like the temple, the tabernacle, is created in two steps. It becomes a sanctuary in time, A, by what we don't do in that place or during that time. And there you have an intrinsic connection, because we don't build the temple on Shabbat, we don't build the tabernacle on Shabbat, and therefore those rules, those laws are the laws we don't do on Shabbat for all eternity. And then we have the positive dimension of how we bring holiness to these two sanctuaries in place and in time. That is done through positive, productive activities. In the case of the Mishkan, through the services, the prayers of the Jewish people and the high priest and the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. And in the case of the sanctuary in time of Shabbat, through celebrating with our friends and with our family, through eating special meals and learning more and praying more, we bring greater holiness to it. So we see that these two dimensions come together to create a fuller sense of holiness. This link between Shabbat and the Mishkan is a very powerful link, to the point where you could say that you cannot celebrate Shabbat without the construction of the Mishkan, and you cannot build a Mishkan, you cannot build a tabernacle without celebrating Shabbat. Why is one contingent on the other? So the deeper question is, why make a sanctuary in the first place? Why is it important to have a sanctuary, either in place or in time? Is it something you can live without or not? In fact, when Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon himself asks this question in the book of Kings. He says, "But will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, the heaven and the heaven of the heavens cannot contain you, much less this temple that I have erected." Solomon says, God, what do you need a temple for? You're going to come and limit yourself and you're going to live here on the temple. You need that? You don't have another place to live? You don't already have some great real estate and a posh mansion somewhere in heaven number 272? I mean, what's the significance? Why do we need to build this in the first place? And the Medrash says, the Holy One, blessed be He, said, "I do not ask for a sanctuary in accordance with my capacity, but in accordance with theirs." Don't build a temple because I need a place to go. I'm fine. God's fine. We're not foolish enough to believe that God needs a temple built to satisfy His personal desires. Rather, God is telling us we need a temple. We need a place to go that we can touch, that we can feel, that we can smell, that we can see, and use that place to connect to God, which is difficult. Sometimes because we don't see God in a visible manner, in a tangible way. So therefore, this will serve as a medium to be able to connect in a more physical fashion. And this makes perfect sense, because to understand and believe that God would need a temple/tabernacle to live would be foolish, wouldn't make sense. So therefore, it makes much more sense to take the perspective that the temple is really designed for all of us. The same can be said for Shabbat, because you might say to yourself, all right, if Shabbat is a sanctuary, right, what is a sanctuary? A sanctuary is a place you run away to. It's a place you run away to. So why is a sanctuary a good thing, whether in place by the Mishkan or in time by Shabbat? Are you running away from the rest of your life? Right? When Shabbat comes, do you run away from Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday? Do you pretend like they don't exist? Do you live in denial? Do you live a split personality? One personality for the rest of the week and then one personality for Shabbat? Could you say the same thing about the Mishkan? That they ran away from what they were doing on a regular basis, living normal lives in society, just to be able to run and live inside of the sanctuary in the Mishkan. Well, that doesn't make sense. That can't be what God desired, not to influence the world and work with society, but rather to run away from it. That's asceticism. It's against Judaism. So how could this sanctuary, both in place and in time, actually fuel and inspire and enhance the rest of existence and the rest of our lives? So if you look at the labors that were performed in the Mishkan, the labors there were performed in three categories. Three categories for all of the various labors that were constructed in the temple. Category number one is food, anything related to food, whether it be cooking, threshing, plowing, sowing. And number two is clothing. We have all kinds of different requirements, whether it be kneading or threading. These were all areas that were under the clothing aspect. The third being shelter. A person needs a home, a roof over their head, and these are the rules that are prohibited from doing on Shabbat related to their performance in the temple and related to the Mishkan. These three basic human necessities, food, clothing, and shelter, are three things a human being can't live without. Can't live without. You need to have food, clothing, and shelter in order to survive. Now, on an average day, what are you doing? You are involved in either food, clothing, or shelter. You may be working in a job, in finance, in law, in medicine. It doesn't matter. It's ultimately to build up your wealth, to have money, to provide food, clothing, and shelter. So what are you consumed with all day, every day? Food, clothing, shelter. Food, clothing, shelter. Food, clothing, shelter. And eventually you get pulled in, you get lulled into believing that this is the greatest definition of your life. That you work to provide food, clothing, and shelter. Comes along the Mishkan. The Mishkan comes along and says, no. It's not just about living for food, clothing, and shelter. Food can be used for a positive purpose. Look, it was done in the temple. Clothing can be used for a positive purpose, for a productive spiritual purpose. Look, it was done in the temple. Shelter can be used. Again, look, it was done in the temple. So when you see these examples of how food, clothing, and shelter are being done for a positive, productive purpose here on earth, it inspires everyone. It inspires people that are not inside the Mishkan, in any other place, to say, I can take my food, clothing, and shelter, and I can turn it into a positive, productive experience. I could do that. I know that because I saw it done in the temple. The same thing could be said for our Shabbat in time, our oasis in time. It's not about running away from the rest of your life, from your work week, to find pleasure and serenity in Shabbat. But rather, when you take time off, and you step aside from making money, and you step aside from every other activity, from your computers and your cell phones and your text messaging and your Facebook statuses, you take a step back from everything to say, here's who my true existence is. My sanctuary is a reflection of who I truly am, and that is a faithful person, a God-fearing person. That's who I am. When you do that, you reevaluate everything in your life. And you refocus everything in your life. And instantly, when you go back to work on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on and so forth, it's going to be inspired by the Shabbat dinner that you had, that oasis in time, that reflection on the fact that it's not about the food, clothing, and shelter, but rather something deeper. So now that I'm back into that grind, and yes, I have to work to provide food, clothing, and shelter, I still am not deluded to think that this is the ultimate part of my existence. This is merely a means so that I can sit down with my family and eat together and pray together and study together. I do that work in order to have the means to be able to provide for my family. So sometimes we take a step back, we remove ourselves into our sanctuary, not to run away from our obligations, not to run away and shun society, but rather to refocus ourselves, reconnect ourselves, re-inspire ourselves to go back to society, whether it be in place, go back to people wherever they are, or in time, go back to every other moment besides your Shabbat, and inspire those times, inspire those places to connect with spirituality. Their food, their clothing, their shelter, every dimension should be connected with our faith, with our positivity. That's what we're looking to do. That's how you create a personal Mishkan and a personal Shabbat, individualized just for you, built around your specifications, because You need to find a sanctuary time. If you don't have a sanctuary time, you can very easily end up in the rat race, just like that CEO on the Brazilian beach that didn't even realize that he had spent years and years of his life working to get back to where he originally started. Only after seeing and talking to this Brazilian fisherman, this local town fisherman, did he recognize and realize the mistake of his ways. He was always focused on making another dollar, another case, another sale, another commission, just so that he could become wealthier, but to get back to what point? To be able to spend time with his family. So now you're with your family, spend time with them. Why do you have to stress yourself and go through all of those different hurdles just to get back to where you originally were? No, I'm not saying people shouldn't work hard and be successful. Of course they can. And ultimately, the Torah is somewhere in between the fisherman and the CEO. The Torah says that we can't live our lives like the fisherman. We can't simply remove ourselves from society, fish for a couple hours, and then just pretend like the world doesn't exist. No, we can't do that. We have to be actively engaged to the best of our ability, working hard to be as productive human beings as possible. So you can't live purely like the fisherman. But on the other hand, you can't live like the CEO either. Because the CEO has lost his mind to the other degree, where he is totally not focused on the fact that life is not about simply making more money and making more money. It's about enjoying ourselves. It's about connecting with our family and understanding who we truly are on the inside. It's about learning more and praying more. And you can't do that if every waking moment is only about food, clothing, shelter, food, clothing, shelter. So both the CEO and the fisherman need to learn a little bit from one another to reach a point of balance, which is what we're all trying to reach. A point of balance where we understand society can be good, it can be beneficial, it can be positive, but every once in a while we need to remove ourselves from it. Every week, remove ourselves from it. That's Shabbat. Celebrate a time when society isn't as significant. It doesn't play a role in every decision we make. Take yourself out of the equation. And go to a place, a shul, a modern-day shul. It's not the temple or tabernacle, but it's a modern-day facility, a modern-day room that's been designated for a productive, positive purpose. And that in and of itself will breed results for you. So if you take the time, if you take the opportunity to go to a spiritual oasis in person and in time, I'm telling you, you will find greater peace and serenity, not just in those moments, but in all of the moments of your life. As always, feel free to email me with any questions, comments, quirks, complaints you might have at askmendy@gmail.com, askmendy@gmail.com. Visit our website, ChabadSouthTampa.com, for more information on our events. I want to remind you that March 23rd is the huge Chabad Gala Dinner Celebration at the Grand Hyatt of Tampa Bay. Over 400 guests from across the Bay Area will be gathering to honor 9 luminaries that have done so much work for the community, and I hope that I will see you there. And our JLI class, To Be a Jew in Modern Times, continues this Tuesday at 7:30. Good night, and good night. Have a wonderful afternoon. We'll see you next week for Blessed Beginnings. Are birthdays meaningless, or do they carry a lot of weight? You'll find out next Monday. Have a great rest of the day.